GPS is supposed to be pretty reliable these days, but I'm sure this isn't the right way to TV centre. Welcome to Click. I'm Spencer Kelly.
And I'm Richard Taylor. This week we're in South Africa, a land with a troubled past and which today faces a unique set of technological problems.
We're taking a road trip across the country to see how South Africans are meeting those challenges with some pretty inventive solutions.
It's an adventure that would take place 9,000 kilometres southeast of our London base. The Click ship left Europe behind, crossed the equator and traversed the world's second largest continent to touch down in South Africa's biggest city, Johannesburg.
This is a land of stark contrasts. It's high-rise, it's wild open space. Rich metropolitan cities, complete with all the trappings of wealth, sit right next door to the poor townships. Sprawling shanty towns created by the apartheid government to house the great unwanted majority. That government is long gone, but the people are still here, raising families, running homes, and making a living in a million different ways. Countless inequalities remain, and access to technology is, of course, just one. Some are already online and raring to go. For many, getting the web comes way down the list below getting a phone line and decent medicine. The digital divide may be just a metaphor, but here you can pretty much draw it in the sand.
But even for those with the wires and the money, getting online is costly. Until recently, South Africa only had one fixed-line broadband provider. Access was expensive and take-up minimal. Even today, fewer than 1 in 100 here have broadband. But as in much of the developing world where fixed line has failed, high-speed wireless technologies are now beginning to flourish. And then there's this guy, Mark Shuttleworth, South African billionaire who's made his money from his net security company VeriSign. Since then, he's become the world's second space tourist and a net entrepreneur to boot.
The interesting thing about South Africa from a technology point of view is that it's a country that blends both very first world infrastructure and real urban and rural development challenges. You have this full spectrum of wealth and poverty. You have the full spectrum of sort of bandwidth and the lack of bandwidth. And so it's an interesting place for new ideas to emerge.
So now it's time to see some of those ideas in action. Right, let's get this gas-guzzling white streak of lightning on the road. Well, eventually we did fire her up and we headed to Peebles Valley, home to a small rural community near the town of White River in the east of the country.
I've got to say, Spen, this is a bit of an unlikely setting for an auto-configuring Wi-Fi mesh network all connected through to a satellite.
Yes, yeah, but it is.
Are you sure we're in the right place?
I am sure. And what's more, it's all done with tin cans.
What, one of these?
Yeah.
No, never.
No, it's amazing what you can do with a bit of metal.
Silly, that's a
Don't
nonsense
call me silly, I've got science on my side.
I've got PP on mine.
And so our conversation went on, Rich taking some convincing that old tin cans really could link the people of this community with each other and the wider world. To prove the point, we went to a local AIDS clinic. Some 2,000 patients received treatment here. There's a satellite dish to access the online database, and the rest of the world for that matter, but making contact just over the hill was a different story.
The biggest problem here was the communication between the clinic here and the community hospice. The doctors and things are here, and there's a nursing team over there, but if they ever wanted to call the doctors, it did get quite complicated.
So, no landline or mobile signal, and two places several kilometres apart who needed to talk to each other. Time for some innovative thinking. Now, cabling an area like this simply doesn't make sense economically, so some kind of wireless link would be in order. The problem with a conventional Wi-Fi network is that it doesn't have the range. A Wi-Fi aerial simply spreads its beam in all directions, actually limiting how far it can travel.
And that's where this thing comes in. It's a regular coffee tin. Baked beans will do just as well. And Rich, if I can borrow your Wi-Fi antenna for a second, if you insert this into the can, you can actually focus the energy of the beam a long way in one direction. This is a CAN antenna.
Or in other words, a CAN-tenna. It's astonishing to think a CAN-tenna can push a signal across several kilometres, but there are some drawbacks. Over time they rust, which means they need to be replaced. And more significantly, CAN-tennas need a direct line of sight to each other, or they won't work at all. Round here with hilly terrain, that's a problem. So the answer, connect the clinic to the hospice indirectly. That's done using other CAN-tennas dotted around the hills in what's known as a mesh network, one which routes the signal efficiently from one point to another until it arrives at its destination.
The benefits are huge. The hospice has gone online. Nurses use voice-over internet calls back to the clinic, and they have access to the online database of patients too. And what's really cool is that everybody else involved whose CAN-tenna links to the network gets on the network too. This is Agnes, a worker at the clinic. She now enjoys internet access, which means she can IM friends, get emails, and even use voice over IP to make phone calls. And all thanks to a tin can. Now, of course, there are other ways to get the net wirelessly. An alternative to Wi-Fi is the mobile phone network, 3G, or even faster HSDPA, which they've had here in South Africa for over a year now. Now, that puts them ahead of most of the developed nations in the world.
And because the range of even a single phone mast extends over several miles, it means I can browse the web at high speed while we're on the move using this laptop, which has got an HSDPA SIM card in it. I'm getting some pretty impressive speeds as well. But there are better uses for 1.8 megabits a second than just streaming videos in the back of a van, as we were about to find out.
As the weather turned, so did we, swapping the quiet rural setting of White River for another river, although this one really should have been a road. Our next stop was back in Joburg, where that high-speed HSDPA signal was serving a whole community. Right next door to one of the city's wealthiest districts sits one of its poorest. This is the township of Alexandra, a sprawling mass of shacks which is home to 1 million residents. And whereas wiring everyone up to the phone network just won't happen, wireless technology could once again triumph.
Alex happens to be close enough to its rich neighbour's mobile mast to be covered by the HSDPA wireless service, and one entrepreneur is taking full advantage. Joe Matlew runs a community payphone kiosk. As well as making mobile calls, the big draw here is broadband speed net access through HSDPA. And instead of blowing all the bandwidth on one machine, the signal is shared between two dumb terminals fed by laptops in the back room.
So Joe, how popular has the service been?
No, we've been so popular that we started by buying 1 gigabyte a month, and now we buy it like 3 gigs a month. And we've been so popular that we're even 10 customers away because of 2 terminals. Then we're looking forward to expanding the business.
The network provider behind the project is planning to implement similar kiosks elsewhere in what appears to be a win-win situation.
For them to fork out the money, pay for a taxi and drive to a government institution, that is standard run-of-the-mill. That's how their day is currently. What we're trying to bring to the table is to firstly introduce technology to them, break that barrier and make them rely more on technology. Then all of a sudden, the 20 Rand or 30 Rand that they had to pay for taxis, they can now save and pay for internet usage and potentially have money back in their pocket still, and then have the entire day because they don't need to stand in queues, etc.
Now, you may have noticed that the machines here are running Windows, and Microsoft is well known for providing heavily subsidized versions of its software for use in the developing world. But for a society where any money is best spent on the basics, software that's completely free is a bonus. This is Ubuntu, a version of the free open source operating system Linux. Backed by our man Mark Shuttleworth, it comes with a range of software like office programs, email, a web browser and a media player. In fact, Intel is now working with the Ubuntu community to create a version of the OS for mobile devices. And, unlike other Linux incarnations, this one is billed as being much more accessible. So what have you done to make this version of Linux more user-friendly?
Focused a lot on people's everyday computing experience. So, for example, making it work well on laptops, supporting suspend and resume, trying to extend the battery life, being clever about how you're using the processor and the disks and so on. Being smarter about wireless networking, detecting whether you plugged into a wired network and automatically reconfiguring things and so on. So really trying to give people a very smooth end user type experience. We aim to be sort of somewhere between the Mac, which is very well known for its ease of use, and Windows, which is very well known for sort of having a diversity of applications, and we want to kind of bring the best of both of those worlds together in something that's freely available globally.
Now, open source as a concept is great. The software is free. The problem is, as we've heard, you might end up paying an awful lot for enough bandwidth to be able to download any of the programs. That is where this thing comes in. It's a freedom toaster. It doesn't burn bread, it burns CDs. The idea is you turn up with your own disk and you can select any of a number of different pieces of open source software to burn onto it. I think I will have Open Office Suite. And then it's simply a touch screen with a computer inside. All the software is already stored on the computer's hard drive, so I will just drag that to CD number 1. Out pops the drawer, stick the CD in, and toast.
Getting the software, free or otherwise, to those who could put it to good use, and then teaching them how to use it, is another huge hurdle. South Africa's younger generation are growing up in a very different country to their parents, but many schools still face massive shortages of textbooks and resources. Kids often face bus journeys of 2 to 3 hours a day just to get into the same room as a specialist teacher.
Next stop for us was Pretoria, where a bunch of school kids are testing a possible solution to the distance problem. This morning's lesson takes place at the local Gatang school, but their teacher, Ron Byers, is giving the lesson from St Albans College, several kilometres away. It's a 5 megabit per second satellite link which is bridging the distance using networking technology developed by Motorola. Video and sound from Ron's lesson is sent live to several schools at once. And importantly, the link is two-way. If kids from any school have a question, they ask Ron through a mic at the front of the class.
And for even more of an interactive feel, they're often asked to use the smartboard, a motion-sensitive whiteboard-type display which is projected onto the wall of every school taking part in the lesson. Now, you had obviously a lot of funding from, a big company from Motorola for this. In the real world, that's probably not going to happen on a large scale. So where's the money going to come from?
I believe that this type of project has to become the responsibility of the government. It's a primary function of government to supply basic education, and in the modern technological world we need to be able to provide access to information, because without access to information students are not going to be able to cope in a technological world.
Of course, the more students who can access quality teaching, the better. And it's claimed the Canopy network could easily be extended to cover distances of more than 100 kilometres.
Well, we've got quite a distance to go ourselves. Where next, Rich?
It's the N4 East to Kruger.
Ah, safari.
Yeah.
Yes, a 6-hour drive beckoned, at the end of which was a chance to put our digital camera know-how to the test. We'll bring you some expert snapping tips from an award-winning photographer, all the while trying not to get eaten by these. Or this.
Welcome to Johannesburg, Josie, Egoli.
Here's a cool use of GPS. This little device isn't just telling us where we are and telling us where we need to go. It's also audibly explaining tourist information about various points of interest as we pass through them on the map. Now, of course, if you're a tourist in South Africa, one of the big draws isn't the big city, it's the Big Five. Yes, an African safari is an opportunity to capture some priceless memories of wildlife that we wouldn't find in our own backyard. But all too often, we find that our camera skills have, well, let us down. Miserably. So our final stop was hundreds of miles northeast of Johannesburg at Djuma on the edge of the Kruger National Park. And to make sure we don't come a cropper ourselves, we enlisted the help of Adrian Bailey. He's the award-winning wildlife snapper who's taken photos like these. And he was to be our wingman on our very own game drives. Well, tomorrow's the big day, the big drive. Adrian, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Okay, so we've got various toys on the table here. Just talk us through what we've got.
We've got a 10 megapixel consumer SLR, about $1,000 worth. We've got a probably $500 or $600 7 megapixel compact, and about a $6,000 combo professional body and lens, 12.5 megapixels.
That's Adrian's own. Apart from the compacts, we've got two separate lenses which screw into the camera. How important is the lens compared to the body of the camera?
Well, the lens is making the image, so it's the most important part of the setup. I always advise people to buy the most expensive lens that they can afford.
People with SLRs tend to scoff at people with compacts, saying there's no way that it can be nearly as creative. Is that true in your experience?
I don't think it's true. It depends on the operator generally. Except for the bottom of the range compacts, which allow you no creative freedom whatsoever, I think the middle to upper range are just fine.
Okay, well that's the technical stuff out the way. Tomorrow we're going to find out who can take the best shots. So Richard, this is your camera.
Lovely jubbly.
This is mine, and this belongs to Adrian, award-winning photographer, who's already said he can also be creative on one of these. So let's see how you get on. I've also won an award, you know, 100-metre breaststroke, 1985.
You might want to take that off.
So gorgeous this time of the morning, isn't it?
Yeah, that's why we're out here first thing in the morning, and I think that's the biggest tip for great photography is to use this good light, which is your first 2 hours of the morning or your last 2 hours of the evening. Getting a much softer, warmer light. It's less contrasty in the shadows. For instance, look at the light in my face. It's soft and warm. You can probably see detail in the shadows of the opposite side of my face. Whereas midday, just from the hatch, it would be completely black from the shadow. One of the biggest problems with macro photography and any photography for that matter is getting a steady shot. If you're not getting a steady shot, whatever work you're putting into it is gonna be wasted. So there's some simple techniques that you can use to get a steady shot. The first is bracing your arms against your body. You've got much more, almost a tripod then for your camera. The other is don't breathe when you release the shutter button. Just either stop breathing at the bottom or the top of your breath, and that way you're not moving up and down. So with this lens, yeah, you see I'm not getting anything. There are situations where autofocus is a liability, and this is one of them. We've got a kudu here with sitting behind all this foliage, and the autofocus is going straight for the foliage in the front, whereas you guys can manually override the autofocus. On this compact, I don't have the ability to do that, so you carry on. So let's talk a bit about composition. A lot of people make the mistake of using their autofocus sensors inside their frame to compose their images. So it's important to focus on composition. There's no hard and fast rules about it, but some things to try might be putting the subject in the extreme left or right of the frame. Another trick that's used widely is the rule of thirds. If you imagine a tic-tac-toe board on your focusing screen, try placing the subject at the intersection of the horizontal and the vertical lines, either left or right, top or bottom. and it generally gives a much more pleasing composition.
What about the height of the subject in the image and the angle that you're taking it from?
Yeah, it's obviously a lot more difficult to do with animals on safari, but obviously they're a lot more dangerous than your pet or your child. But it always helps to get a sense of intimacy with your subject, and the easiest way to achieve that is to get down to their height.
Okay, Adrian, the elephant's still in sun, but we're in shade, so the sun's going down. What kind of mode should I be using? Because there's so many on these cameras.
Yeah, when a camera determines an exposure, it's a combination of the shutter speed, which is the length of time that the shutter keeps open and closed for, and the aperture size, which is the size of the aperture in the lens that lets the light through onto the sensor. In aperture priority mode, you determine the aperture that you would like, and the camera determines the shutter speed to match it to give a correct exposure. In shutter speed priority, you determine the shutter speed you need, and the camera determines the correct aperture for the exposure. In my opinion, the aperture priority is the easiest to do because you're always going to get a correct result. If you're choosing a shutter speed that's not necessarily going to be achievable with the light available, then you've got a bit of a problem.
You know, my sunset shots and my evening shots, they never actually turn out the way I see them with my eyes. What's going wrong?
99% of the time, don't try and interfere with your camera's metering. But at a time with when you're trying to photograph a sunset, is a good time to start that. What is happening is the contrast between the sky and your subject is just too much for either a film or a digital sensor to deal with. So what you need to do here is expose specifically for the sky, then bring your shot back and recompose, and then you'll get the color popping out of the sky.
So that would explain why the sky always looks washed out.
Yeah, because you're exposing for the foreground rather than the sky.
Okay, well sadly that's our safari drives out the way. We have the 3 best shots on the machine, one from each of us. Adrian, just talk us through why you've chosen each to be the best.
Well, the 3 images, the first is a silhouette of one of our tracker on the drive. It's a great image. It's slightly too dark. You could have slightly changed the exposure, or maybe even added an off-camera flash to get a bit of light from his silhouette. But no, nevertheless, it's a great image. The landscape is also beautiful framing, but it's a tunnel that leads you to something that, although it's a great image in itself, you seem to want to find something more in the center of the image. The third image is an image of the butterfly. It's also a very nicely framed image, but possibly could have used a bit of off-camera flash instead of direct flash, which would have given a bit more depth to the image.
Now, good as these are, one thing we haven't told you is exactly who took which photo.
There's a very good reason for that. We're going to put these 3 photos up on our website, and we're going to ask you to vote for your favourite. And in a few weeks' time, we'll tell you who's won. Award-winning photographer with the compact, Richard with the mid-range SLR, or me with the Beast. So, check out the pictures at our website. The address, bbc.co.uk/click. All the details on how to vote are at the site.
Well, sorry to say, our South African voyage is over.
However, our journey does not end here. Next week, we're parachuting into Namibia to see how well our technology works in one of the most remote corners of the world. It's going to be a heck of a ride.